Hello, everyone. Very warm welcome to this Institute government event on Afghanistan. What did 20 years achieve and what should the UK do now? I'm Bronwen Maddox, I'm director of the Institute. The UK's 2-decade-long campaign in Afghanistan ended this summer with the withdrawal of British troops and diplomatic personnel from Kabul. A mission that began with the overthrow of the Taliban ended with the Taliban returning to power. And the mission ended, as we all know, rapidly and chaotically. Only yesterday, in a statement to MPs, a former Foreign Office official, Raphael Marshall, described the Foreign Office's handling of the Afghan evacuation after the Taliban seized Kabul as deeply dysfunctional and resulting in a failure to meet the UK's commitments to the Afghans it had worked with. So what did the UK's 20-year stay in Afghanistan accomplish? Should politicians or the military take the blame for the failures? And how should Afghans and the international community approach the next phase of Taliban rule? Well, to discuss these questions and many more, and please do start sending your questions in, I'm joined by a really brilliant panel. Jack Straw was the UK government's Foreign Secretary from 2001 to 2005, was part of Tony Blair's government that sent UK troops into Afghanistan, and he was the first foreign minister to visit the country after the overthrow of the Taliban. Tobias Ellwood is the Conservative MP for Bournemouth East, a former minister at both the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence, and now the chair of the House of Commons Defence Select Committee. And I'm delighted that we're joined as well by Hasina, Safi, a former minister in the Afghan government who from May 2020 until the return of the Taliban was the country's acting minister for women. Very warm welcome to all of you. Before we kick off, some brief housekeeping arrangements. We're going to be live tweeting from IFG events using the hashtag IFG Afghanistan. Please follow and tweet along. Please do send in your questions for our panel as early as you like, and that can be right now. And do include your name and where you're viewing from if you can. It really does make a difference. You can post your questions in the panel that's on the right of your screen. We're going to have a video and sound recording on our website within 24 hours. And this is going to run to at least 12:30, possibly 1:45, given the range of what we're talking about and the questions you may send. But Tobias Ellwood has to leave a bit before 12:30, so I will try to get in his best answers before then. Well, we're going to talk about the past, failure and success, and about the future, what to do now. But first, I just want to begin with one question to Hasina. How did you leave Afghanistan? And indeed, are you still in touch with people in the country?
Thank you very much, Bronwen. I would like to thank Institute for the government for this opportunity. It is indeed an indicator of support and commitment that Britain will move forward for the people of Afghanistan. So thank you very much. How I left Afghanistan in an uncertain situation, very horrifically, as a woman, as someone who came after the first 2 decades of spending refuge and worked hard in the last 2 decades in order to stand by for the people of her country. I lived in a very uncertain, horrific and terrible situation. Yes, I am in contact with the women in Afghanistan, with the women who have been evacuated all around. I'm in contact with them on daily basis and maybe twice or 3 times a day about what is their situation and what is that we can all together help them for the way forward.
Thank you very much indeed from that. And you're speaking from Britain now, aren't you? I'm not going to say where you are, but you're in Britain now.
Yes, I am in Britain. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Let's start then with the past. The country that UK left behind, the achievements, failures of those 2 decades, the billions spent, the lives lost. Jack Straw, I wonder if I could begin with you. The UK entered, as I said, to remove the Taliban. Then the UK has left, along with other countries. Taliban is back. You've said the West has been humiliated. How do you take stock of the picture now?
Well, we went in for very good reasons. I have described this in the past as a war of necessity. I mean, the US and its allies could just have sat on their hands after 9/11, but that was frankly almost inconceivable. And therefore, once the Taliban had refused the ultimatum which President Bush and the United Nations presented to them, which was to give access to Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, a military invasion was inevitable. And what took us by surprise then, with a sort of reversal of what subsequently happened, was the rapidity of the collapse of the Taliban. As you've said, Bronwen, I was, I think, the first foreign minister to go to Afghanistan, certainly Western foreign minister, and I think you were on that trip, although I may be mistaken.
No, you're not mistaken.
Yeah, and one of the images that are still graphically in my mind is visiting a girls' high school in Kabul, just up on the edge of Kabul. And this had been a two-story girls' high school, but you may remember it was only a one-story girls' high school because the top had been shelled by the Taliban during the earlier civil war. And I met a number of women who were both mothers, and some of whom were teachers as well, with some of their daughters, who talked about how terrible it had been during the period of the Taliban then, and how they'd not only been denied education, but educating a daughter had been made a criminal offence. And one of them showed me this official-looking document, which she said was a record of her conviction for educating her daughter. And you may recall that I showed that to the interpreter, who read it out, and it was indeed her conviction for educating her daughter. I mean, absolutely staggering notion in the, well, right at the beginning of the 21st century. My own view during the period that we were there was that we were making progress. It was far from perfect. I mean, I think that in retrospect, we can see that we probably pushed things a bit far and fast with the Bonn process, which was at the end of 2001 to set up a government. But basically, progress was being made. If I'm asked to reflect on the period that we were in government, it was that I think the great increase in British troops, which took place, well, was being planned at the end of 2005 and implemented in 2006, to take over for Britain responsibility for the Helmand province and put in, as I recall, an extra 5,000 troops, wasn't sufficiently well planned. And we should have, frankly, had, if we were going to do an effective job then, we should have put in many more troops. So that's my assessment of that period, but was absolutely clear that we had to do it. And although life was very far from perfect for people, it was better than it had been. The other mistake, I think, more recently, and Hasina may disagree with me about this, but that was made by the West, particularly the US, but the British government went along with this, was that there was a contested, or two contested elections in Afghanistan in post-2010 between Ashraf Ghani, former World Bank official, and Dr. Abdullah, who had been the foreign minister, and I got to know very well. It looked to me on the outside, on both occasions, Abdullah had actually won, but he was less regarded less amenable to US interests than Ashraf Ghani. So Ashraf Ghani was basically, it was arranged for him to become president with some kind of cohabitation with Dr. Abdullah. I was clear at the time that was a mistake, because Ashraf Ghani, as we now know, had only a fairly didn't have solid roots. I mean, he was Afghani, but he didn't have solid roots in Afghanistan. And fleeing when the Taliban were quite close, sent out a terrible message. Whereas all credit to Abdullah and to Hamid Karzai that they stayed and you know, have and indeed are still there. But that I think was a major mistake.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you for offering up those mistakes. Forgive me for labouring the point, but I want to ask you about some of the other decisions early on, because your first answer is very interesting. You mentioned this this certificate of this woman condemned for sending her girl, her daughter to school, and you were describing that just before as a war of necessity. In the US, there's a lot of commentary including from those involved, saying, look, one of the big mistakes was that the mission changed immediately from getting rid of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda after 9/11 to nation building, and that the US was never quite as on board with the nation building as its allies in NATO were. And immediately there was this morphing to much more ambitious aims of developing society. That's one. And the second one, again, drawing a lot on US commentary, of which there is a great deal, a lot of congressional interviews with people who are very involved, saying that in some respect, from their perspective, perhaps some of the lethal mistakes had been made within the first 3 years by doing deals with the warlords who were hated by the Afghan people, not trusted by them, and setting up the basis for a state that became more and more corrupt, with billions of dollars going in and disappearing, and that actually it was incredibly hard to retrieve things from that point. I wanted to just on those two. There's a long list of mistakes we might discuss, but on those two, the morphing of the mission and the warlords. I wonder if you could comment.
My view was then and is now that if you were going to remove a regime like the Taliban, you then had to decide what you're going to put in its place. I mean, this is different from the Gulf War in 1991, when controversially, but I think understandably, Colin Powell, who was then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the US, persuaded Bush 41 that they should simply remove the Iraqis from Kuwait and then leave the Iraqis to their fate. And Iraq continued to be a functioning state. Well, that was pushing one state out of another. In this situation, we had removed the Taliban, removed the government. If we'd simply said, fine, mission done, we're off, the Taliban would have reappeared. So this is, it's not a direct parallel, but I mean, after the war, the United States recognized that in the state of Germany and the state of Japan, they had to do some nation building. So they did. It turns out that was very successful. Much more difficult in Afghanistan, but there wasn't. I mean, for whatever it's now being said in the US, there wasn't any debate, as I recall, amongst the allies at the Bonn conference that we shouldn't make an effort to build up a new constitution and therefore a new state. I mean, I think there was mission creep and there was also profound mission confusion. And one of the things I've reflected on is how I mean, this is Brits, including me, we had allowed an anti-narcotic imperative to get in the way of an anti-terrorist imperative. And the truth is, I mean, unless and until you can, in a mega way, replace the propagation of poppies and other drugs in Afghanistan, you're going to have to put up with that.
Yeah. All right, and that was Tony Blair had said very deliberately. Look, one of our reasons for going in is the drugs policy. These drugs end up on British streets. We're going to do something about it. All right, let's agree that was immensely ambitious, looking back. But just briefly on this warlords point.
Well, I don't think we had much choice is the answer. I mean, they controlled areas. How they were viewed by the Afghan population depended locally on their own reputations. But I'm afraid that corruption in that part of the world, and it's true in Iran, it's true in Pakistan, it's true in India, for all sorts of reasons, is an endemic problem. And we created it, and we weren't actually going to solve it either, but I'm for sure. We were very negligent, we the West, the Allies, about what then happened to a lot of our money, and also, for example, material for defence purposes.
Thank you for that. Tobias Ellwood, you've said that the UK has very little to show for 20 years in the country, and in addition that members of the British military have been let down by their political masters throughout, just at the time of the departure. Again, how do you take stock of this?
A pleasure to be on this panel, and so important to understand what happened in the last 20 years, why we went in the first, perhaps how we lost sight of what we were then trying to do, and then of course the humiliation, which I agree with Jack, on how we actually departed. We didn't really have a strategy once, beyond defeating Al Qaeda. And if you want to understand the history of Afghanistan in its recent history, you have to understand the Taliban. To understand the Taliban, you need to understand the Mujahideen. If you want to understand the Mujahideen, you need to understand the Soviet occupation. And if you want to understand the Soviet occupation, you need to understand the US foreign policy to get rid of the Soviets. And until you put all that together, you then get an appreciation of what you're stepping into. I'm not sure that was really appreciated, not so much by the CIA and MI6 and indeed the military, but actually the political, particularly Donald Rumsfeld, who made some schoolboy errors, and quickly to rattle them off. Firstly, was to impose a centralized government, because we've now all learned the history of Afghanistan, going back to Durrani, Dost Mohammed, Zahir Shah. You've always had a strong central figure, but actually the power is in the down on the very local basis, and we didn't really appreciate that. We tried to run everything from Kabul. It's never going to happen. In fact, the Taliban played into this because things didn't improve on the local level. The second one was we didn't start to train an indigenous capability, local forces, until about 6 years after the initial invasion in 2001, 2007 and 8 is when we started to try and build an Afghan security force, far too late in the day. And the third big error was that the Taliban actually asked to come to the table in Bonn back in 2001. How different things would have been if they would have been included. Have we not learned anything from Northern Ireland? That ultimately, much as it's tough though it might be, you have to talk to those very people that you were up against before. And we didn't do that. We tried to do that. And of course, they crossed the border to Pakistan and decided to regroup. And then the final aspect was the development. We created this umbrella of security. That's what our armed forces did. Not enough activity took place underneath that umbrella to change people's lives. And again, after 20 years, we had little to show for it. And this is why eventually leaders such as Biden and indeed Trump, first of all, said, we've had enough. Let's just get out, somebody else's problem. And we're now living with the consequences.
And thank you for that. So again, a sweep over the 20 years and the mistakes made. Your point about members of the British military being let down by their political masters. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, after a while, we in Helmand province in particular, this is where the British forces were focused. We were starting to make dividends. We were starting to change things and tackle, the opium crops and so forth, and work on the local basis, train indigenous security capabilities. And now all that's been undone. We've abandoned the equipment, we've abandoned the country as well. And many of those in the armed forces who have given, sacrifices, some come back with injuries, some, who are friends have not come back at all, quite rightly are scratching their heads and saying, what was it all for? The only thing I can tell them is that the change of society as a whole in Afghanistan over 20 years has been so huge that the Taliban cannot unpick that and take it back to 1996, because the country, the Herat, Mazar-e-Sharif, Jalalabad, Kabul, they swelled in size. People now have mobile phones. There's whole communities there that are living a very different lifestyle that the Taliban are not able to undo. And it's the fact that the Taliban are now coming in and they're not used to governing. They have no capability and they're not one monolithic organization, which means that they will now struggle with the country, which is why we need to get over this issue of working with the Taliban to get through what will actually be a very, very challenging winter if we are to avoid the famine and indeed the starvation, which is likely to take place simply because the Taliban cannot manage. They don't have experience in running a country now as complicated as Afghanistan is today.
I'm going to come to Hasina in a second on these points, but you're right about the change. There is a banking system. I remember the central bank saying the first thing we need is pencils. Let me just ask you though about this point about the discussion about how the Foreign Office in particular handled the exit over this summer and the discussion in the House of Commons this week what do you make of the really pretty searing accounts of people not at their desks, not answering emails, and the impact that had on many Afghans who were looking to the UK for help?
Yeah, this has been an astonishing eye-opener to have a 25-year-old junior civil servant expose what was going on. But I think we all knew this anyway. The disjoint between what the MOD was doing and the FCDO. We can do better than this. I know we've done better in the past. I actually recall going to Jack Straw after the Bali bombings and saying, let's create a crisis center, which they now did. That wasn't used correctly in this case. It's why we need an inquiry into what actually happened there. You know, emails weren't answered. There was an inadequate language skills. They've dissipated. Shortage of IT systems as well. Lack of leadership. We know we can do better. And in the spirit of global Britain, because we're probably going to have to do this all again, we must do better as well. It's not just FCDO. It's actually the Whitehall construct. We need to be better at coordinating siloed departments to deal with emergencies such as this.
Thank you. Well, Hasina, I want to come to you at this point. You've heard these accounts, two lists of things that the West and Britain now thinks could have been done differently, or at least that Jack Straw and Tobias Ellwood think could have been done differently. So if I ask you just the big question, what did the West achieve in 20 years? How would you answer?
As someone who had been very, very innerly involved with people, I think what they achieved was a very premier or primary basis for nation building. To be very clear and very prompt and brief, because they really, in one way, struggled. I will not go to gaps, as both of them, Tobias and Jack, mentioned that. But in the last 2 decades, there was a measure which we all traveled together, the West and those who really worked. So, for example, inclusion, participation, education, health, like these are all the things which we cannot ignore. Culture, mobility, participation, networking, these are all the things which really happened. Media, business, like these were all the things which happened. And if the evacuation process or the exit strategy have been very analytically planned, we could really be on the top of the flow. We could really plan a very, very less, what should I say, less endangering or less risky plan for the people. Like what happened? I was there. I really saw, like, suddenly if you put someone in a grave, like in the dark, there were so many people who even did not me, like as a minister. On 15th August, our ministry had organized 600 internal first aid packs for the women who had been internally displaced. And I did not know that 10 days after that, I will be waiting for an internally displaced kit. So that is why there had been initiatives which worked, like education. It's really an eye-opening. There were so many widows, so many women-headed families. They really started living. We cannot evacuate all Afghanistan, but those who are at risk. So it was not really planned for those who are staying there. The drought, now the cold weather. So I'm in contact on daily basis. I really see how people are starving and how they have expectation from us all.
So I'm going to come on to what we do in the future and to help Afghanistan in a moment. But let me just ask you, what has been left behind? 20 years of effort. As Tobias Ellwood was saying, the society, particularly in the cities, changed enormously. Yes. With the Taliban back, does all that just blow away? Or has some of that stayed?
No, some has stayed, because as a result of the last 2 decades of investment, there are people who resist. There are people who do not stop. They take their lives at risk, but they try to not let the gains fall down. So there is, for example, small little businesses. There are people who are still waiting for the help. So that can really give us hope and a step for moving forward. Women participation, women education, number of doctors, female doctors, engineers, small little businesses for widows. They are all the things which are stopped, which are pending there. So that is what can give them hope, and also we can help them from here.
So right now, what is the position on girls' education?
It's different. As of my information, in some of the provinces, I think 3 or 4 provinces, girls are going. But for the rest, they are not going. They are all at home, not only the schools, those who were in the last year of medical, like after 1 year or 6 months, they would be on their house jobs, but they are not all sitting home now. So what will happen? Is it going to be a repeat of 1996? So that is what we really need to think and plan for now.
Okay, so that's just 2 or 3 provinces out of 34.
Yes.
That's not very many at all. And so as we just begin to turn into this next question of what to do in the future, specifically what can the UK do, but what can the West do to help Afghanistan? Let me ask you one thing. Should we deal with the Taliban government now?
I think definitely we should deal, but the definition of deal should be clear. How does the deal help people? How does the deal help service delivery? How does the deal help those who have nothing to warm them up? How does the deal help those who have no bread, but they have bread in their houses? How does the deal help the teachers who are ready to teach, but they cannot go to school? How does the deal help those who want to get money from the bank and they are not allowed to take more than 20,000 apps? So the definition of deal should be based on the service delivery in support of public. Governments are always made for public. If a government cannot deliver to public, it's no government. So the deal should concentrate on public support.
Thank you. So Jack Straw, let me turn to you now as we turn to this question of the future. What do we do?
Well, except we're in a jam. In terms of dealing with the Taliban, I agree with Hasina. We have to deal with the Taliban. That's easy to say. It's then the question arises, on what basis do we deal with them? Do we get to a point where we recognise them as a legitimate government? How much aid do we give them? And I certainly think that both should be a clear prospect of our policy approach. There's no point us saying, well, the Taliban are unpleasant people, we should have nothing to do with them, because I'm afraid we have diplomatic relations with all sorts of unpleasant regimes, from North Korea and Myanmar through a very long list. And one of the realities of diplomacy is you can't pick and choose the governments you're dealing with. And I think if we want to have any kind of traction and influence in Afghanistan, we have to deal with them. We say how we could, and it's then really tricky, because the Taliban, for sure, they have an ideology and a religious approach to life, but they're not united themselves. So it's how you best kind of open up divisions inside the Taliban and start a debate there about we the West will give you X if in return for Y. So very, I think we need to do it and to get engaged. We also need to be talking more to the near neighbours of Afghanistan, particularly Pakistan and Iran. It's worth bearing in mind that there is a common language between Iran and Afghanistan. I mean, one's called Farsi, the other's called Dari, but they are essentially the same. Iran has always had big equity in Afghanistan, and actually 20 years ago, the Iranians were incredibly helpful to us in terms of providing us with intelligence, and they ensured that we were able to remove the Taliban government much more rapidly than would otherwise be the case. You've then got Pakistan, this great sort of shadow over anybody's policy apart from theirs in Afghanistan. They have long nurtured and supported the Taliban, and I'm afraid we turned a blind eye to that for other reasons, which we shouldn't have done. I mean, particularly the elected government say, well, no, we didn't, but the intelligence services, Inter-Services Intelligence Department of the Pakistan Armed Forces, by far and away the most powerful set of institutions in Pakistan, far more powerful than the so-called elected government. They have been there and funding and helping and supporting the Taliban for all sorts of reasons, partly because they are so worried that otherwise the Afghans might develop an alliance with India, and they're paranoid about that. But working out a strategy for dealing with Pakistan and Pakistani and India is critically important, because just bear in mind that the closest ally and the most important ally that Pakistan has is not the United Kingdom, it's not the United States, it's China.
Yes, I'm going to come on to the Chinese question in just a second, but just on this point about what we do right now, and you've described all kinds of things, I think very plausibly, that we ought to work at. But the country is starving. A lot of Afghan assets frozen overseas. Do we, the West, hand some of those to the Taliban, or try and get them into the country by other means, or not at all?
Well, I think the crucial thing is, first of all, how do we try to do what we can to avert an humanitarian catastrophe this winter?
Yep.
Now, I'm not sure whether handing over assets to them is going to solve that. Certainly, making food aid available would, and that's, I think, should be the priority. The handing over the assets, I think, handing over the assets or giving access to the assets would be part of a progressive deal with the Taliban soon, but not immediately.
Okay, thank you. Tobias Ellwood, what do we do now? The big question, and the really immediate question, as I said, and as Hasina has referred to, the country's starving. We're seeing reports of this everywhere. What do we do?
Well, I just echo Jack's concerns, and I think the urgency I touched on before is this winter, and everybody needs to lean in to help. Put aside any discussions about recognition of Taliban as such, and actually say it is the 40 million people that are left behind that need our support. And a lot of this does hinge around international funding. The 9 billion that's been spoken of that's tied up in frozen assets, I can't see that being released. I was in the United States not long ago. Already you have victims of 9/11, families involved in the terrorist attacks there that are making claims, legal claims, wanting some of that cash. It's tied up, and until those are resolved, that 9 billion is not going to be accessible. But the World Bank can provide its own support, its assets, particularly to UN agencies, and I speak of the World Health Organization, the World Food Programme, UNICEF. These are the critical ones that need to be given proper access, and they need to have their teams bolstered to be able to work right across the country in order for us to avoid 1 million children, for example, from starving and actually freezing to death, which is a very likely possibility. You then have the next phase, which is what happens in the country as a whole under the Taliban control. In my view, I don't think the music stopped. Much of the country, north of the Hindu Kush, was never controlled by the Taliban the first time round. Places like Mazar-e-Sharif, Uzbeks, Tajiks, and so forth, they're all in the north. They're not going to just turn over lightly and say, fine, this is how it now is. They'll be regrouping, they'll be retraining, rearming, and I'm afraid there's another couple of turns of this in this chapter before things really do settle down. And there's some big questions for the West as to how we react to that. Pakistan has been touched on. I know you want to perhaps turn to that shortly, but it's not a clear challenge issues there. Pakistan have got their own Taliban issues who may be looking at this and saying, fine, I can see what the Taliban, Afghan Taliban did in that country. Let's have a bit of that in our neck of the woods as well. And then you've got a bigger question to do with Western resolve, because one thing that's come away from this is just how disunited the West actually is, unable to coordinate what they want to do with their foreign policy and their long-term commitments. Terrorism is going to be a major issue. I actually had an opportunity to meet Mutaki, the foreign policy representative in Doha, and he actually made it very clear that I think Jack touched on this. This is not a monolithic organization, the Taliban. We speak of it as one name, but they're not able to control every element of this. And indeed, because of the money situation, because people are not being paid, the Taliban are hemorrhaging people to ISIS-K because their income is coming from a different angle, from Middle East funds, from individual private donations as well. And they're wanting a more committed, ruthless interpretation of Sharia law, which the Taliban as a whole is trying to be more moderate. That's what they promised in the Doha Accord. So many challenges there. But ultimately, I don't see us having, at the moment, leading into this enough. It's almost as if, fine, this has been embarrassing, but let's just turn it away and almost forget about it.
Yeah, and until this particular British controversy over the Foreign Office behaviour rose up in the Commons again. I mean, it's striking how little commentary there has been. The media has kept reporters there, and it has kept, but it's fallen off the main papers. Hasina, what needs to happen this winter? We've heard all these reports of people on the edge of starvation.
Thank you very much. I think the first thing is an urgent action plan, a very well coordinated plan for all the funding who want to urgently support Afghan people in the winter. Whether the easiest way, whether it's through resources, whether it's through cash, whether it's through other channels. But the first thing is for the cold weather, the supplies and the support. The second thing is for those provinces, we have had reports that drought is happening, to really see how they are helped. The third thing is the salary we see in the news, but no one has been paid yet. No one has been paid yet. So they should be, if whoever is taking the responsibility, I heard 3 countries were taking, but it was just on the news. No one has been paid. And unless they are not paid, they cannot help themselves either. So the fourth thing is the restart of the education, the schools and the higher education. The fifth thing on the whole is, I think there should be a very high level coordination leadership mechanism for all the resources which is going to Afghanistan. As a lessons learned, there should be a parallel monitoring mechanism to really see how much is really going. $1 million is planned for Afghanistan, for an Afghan woman or girl, but even $1 is not getting down to them. Why? What is the reason? What are the challenges?
Yes.
The third thing is, there are successful local structures. There are successful local councils. There are successful local trustworthy structures and mechanisms. The usage and reviving of that, which is also one of the success indicators of the last 20 years. The last thing is, I think, more and more coordination and transparency. More, because there is a group who have confidence still that they will be helped. We really have to show the real definition of humanity, to really see there are people who care about them, there are people who think about them, and there are people who really want to help them. These are the 5 major points. I think for the long term, all of them need to be in a clearly defined vision of international support to the people of Afghanistan.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. We're going to go to questions now. Thanks. There's a lot of good questions streaming in. And I put aside the China question earlier when Jack Straw raised it, but let me just, there's a pair of questions now on China. One from Keith Best saying, how serious is further intervention in Afghanistan by China now that both Russia and the West have had their fingers burned? Should we be worried? And another one, let me find it, from Simon Morley saying, are we avoiding difficult, containing China looks back to Cold War comfort, while real problems are war among the situations in the Middle East, fringes of Afghanistan, the Sahel, even Ukraine. Are we not looking at the real problems? And I think the question is saying focusing too much on containing China. Tobias, I know you're coming up to your deadline. Do you want to take that first?
Yeah, certainly. I think China is watching and learning very, very carefully as to what's happening in Afghanistan. It has a thirst for minerals, for lithium, for copper, for all these other things. It pays a scant regard to human rights issues and so on. It'll want to tap into the resources that Afghanistan operates. It might want to try and make a land link between a sort of a corridor, if you like, linking up to Pakistan, avoiding Taiwan in case that gets a little bit spicy in that next neck of the woods as well. Interesting about whether there is going to be a relationship between the Taliban and China, given the Uyghur population is Muslim as well, and would the Taliban be trusted that they wouldn't somehow then provide mutual support in the long term? So China, I think, is being, as they do, being very strategic about this and very, very patient about this as well. But ultimately, they will be looking more, I think, bigger picture and recognizing, and I touched on this before, just how divided the West is. And that might give them energy to be a bit more forthright, a bit more robust, a bit more ruthless in pursuing their own geopolitical strategies across the world.
Thank you. And I've also got a question from Christine Wilson in Norwich saying, to what extent will the mineral wealth of Afghanistan influence British foreign policy there in the future? Jack, what's your view?
Well, on the mineral wealth, I mean, it is, as Tobias has said, it's mineral rich. The problem is actually getting the stuff out of Afghanistan because the roads are so poor, and that has led to incredible difficulty. But some of the minerals, very high value ones like lithium, I mean, they will be able to get out, and it's in a sense inevitable that those are more likely to be brought out by the Chinese, both because they are so much closer and they need more of this stuff, and so they will try and clean up. It is striking, by the way, that neither China nor Russia removed their embassies when the chaos was on in August, whereas we did effectively abandon our embassy. And I just want to say this in terms of lessons to be learned. I was struck when I was Foreign Secretary, and I think it's got worse, by a kind of risk-averse view amongst some of the senior officials. And I remember on one occasion that I was asked to close an embassy in a pretty difficult, risky Middle East country. And I said, well, I'm not going to do it, and without discussing this directly with our ambassador, because there are people, I describe them as Chosworth people in the office in King Charles Street saying, you've got to close it, you've got to close it, Foreign Secretary, you've got to do this. They could all be dead. So, which I understood, I wasn't, for any sense, cavalier about this, but I phoned our ambassador, or arranged to phone her, speak from home to her home on a secure line, no one listening, and just asked her to level with me. And that ambassador said, I've got family here, I'm not stupid, but my view is that I and my staff are willing to take the risk. And so the risk was taken, and actually that particular ambassador was fine. Now, and I think that part of Britain's humiliation was to do with this risk-averse view inside the Foreign Office, with, I mean, people like Philip Barton and the others, good people, but they need to think about the kind of role they undertook.
He's the permanent secretary, for those not fluent in every bit of Whitehall.
Yeah. Going back to China, it's just a reality that China is going to as Tobias has said, is going to use the vacuum that's been created by the West to move in there, and so will Pakistan. In China will play. It knows it's got to play a delicate game because of the Uyghurs, because there are other concerns that the Chinese have about Islamic extremists. But on the other hand, they will wish to keep their relationship with Pakistan intact, and they will, I think, generally take the view that if they got influence in Afghanistan, they're more likely to keep the Taliban under control than if they too walk away, leaving aside their own economic interest.
Thank you. Hasina, are people in Afghanistan worried about the influence of China?
I think they are, especially those provinces who have the borders like Wakhan and these places, because the experience that I had in the Ministry of Information and Culture prior to Ministry of Women Affairs, I had been in contact with the Chinese cultural affairs and issues like that. People have been, not now, but people have been worried about their interventions and involvement in Afghanistan.
Okay, thank you. I'll squeeze in one more to Tobias Ellwood before he has to run, if that's right with you. And it's really about, there's several questions about who should have been evacuated by Britain. Here's one, no name given, saying a lot has been said about the tragedy of so many left behind, but it could be argued that the UK evacuation was too ambitious or generous, that we should have limited to UK citizens and their immediate families plus others, such as interpreters who've been directly employed by the UK, no extended family, no special cases. Might that have been more effective and seen here and in Afghanistan as fairer? Tobias Ellwood.
I think it's fair to say that we had such an open approach to this, and there was chaos at the airport itself with the interpretation as to who could be allowed on the flight. I think only 1% of people that presented their credentials were actually turned away, and that suggests that the bar, was very, very low indeed into having connections somehow with who people work with during the 20 years, rather than making sure it was those people that genuinely lives were in danger, because just many people simply wanted to get out. I think why there are lessons to be learned is that France, for example, completed their entirety of their evacuation during the spring and in the early summer. So it wasn't left to the very late day of the 31st of August. My frustration is that the intelligence picture that you get, and Jack Straw, I hope, will confirm this, as Foreign Secretary, you are privileged to some interesting and very helpful intelligence assessments. In this case, would have shown what was coming over the horizon, the speed in which things are going to collapse in the last few weeks. Certainly that should have meant that all leave was cancelled. Nobody should have been on their holidays.
Of course.
But more important, you could get a program in place which made sure that you got the people out that deserve to get out. There's other operational questions, why Bagram Airport was closed down as well, other issues too. We were focused in Helmand, Lashkar and Camp Bastion. Why did we then abandon them before we'd got our people out too? Many, many questions to be answered still.
Thank you. I know you have to go. It is a very, very busy day in the Commons. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thanks.
Can I say thank you very much indeed? It's a pleasure to join you and also this panel here today. Thank you very much indeed.
A pleasure to have you, and then we will start watching you lot when we've finished discussing Afghanistan. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Jack Straw, and you were Home Secretary for 4 years straight before you were Foreign Secretary, and also, deal with these questions of who should come in.
Yeah.
What do you make of the decisions Britain made this autumn and what it's making now?
Well, if you're talking of the decisions as to who, as it were, got on the planes, I think broadly, probably at those decisions, probably the British government got right. I mean, I think they're incredibly difficult to assess who had a claim and who didn't have a claim. The difficulty was that we didn't have enough people there, and that we didn't evacuate enough people. I know the Prime Minister said we already evacuated 15,000 people, but we needed to have evacuated more. And critically, picking up Tobias Ellwood's point, we needed, since the intelligence would have been there one scenario, at least, just put it at its mildest, was going to be the Taliban would sweep across the country for a whole variety of reasons, and that the opposition to them would collapse, to the Taliban would go. We should have worked on that much earlier. We should, as Tobias said, cancel all leave, and that, I'm afraid, had to include the leave of the permanent undersecretary, the senior official in the Foreign Office, and of course the Foreign Secretary. And in deciding both to go on holiday and to stay on holiday, those senior people sent out entirely the wrong messages to the rest of the office. So they've treated this as a kind of second order issue rather than a first order issue. I mean, on the wider issue, Bronwen, of giving asylum to people, on the whole, once people get to the UK from Afghanistan, they are given either asylum or a right to remain, because it's so difficult, not least to return them. I mean, there's a much bigger question about whether the 1951 Refugee Convention is suitable for today's circumstances, and I don't suggest we get into that. But we could and should have done more quickly on the ground when this crisis started to come up in late July and early August.
Thank you very much for that. And Hasina, do you think have we picked the right people to come here? What are your thoughts both about the evacuation and the policy in general?
I think, first of all, as a woman, as an Afghan woman who have worked in the last 20 years with Britain and with British programs, I will not regret, because it was the coordination of the women organizations, the women networks, definitely the foreign ministry, that me and like me, there is a group of women who are in different parts of UK, they are residing. To come to your question, basically what I observe in my surroundings, they are all the people who have been affiliated with Britain. Like in the place where I'm staying, it's around 300 or more than 300 people. And there may be one person like me, but most of them are the people who had been directly involved in different programs, or maybe they had their spouses who were in Kabul and they were at rest, they are here. One of the issues which I would suggest is for human rights and women's rights defenders, or those who have really worked, because no matter for me if it was government or non-government, but the women worked. And today they are at high risk. For example, as a women ministry, 98% of my provincial directors are stuck in Kabul. They are not supported by anyone. Why? Because they do not know English, first thing. The second thing is that because they were government, so they were not directly in contact with the international community. So with like them, they are—
Hasina, are these people trying to leave Afghanistan?
Yes,
yeah.
They are trying. And also I'm in contact with some international partners. If they can at least help them, like the group of MPs, like the group of women deputy ministers, to help them. But I think this is not only for me, but a big question for all the women provincial directors of women ministry, that was it a crime to work in women ministry? Was it not good to be a part of a structure for gender equality and women empowerment?
Yeah.
Because they did not know an individual. They worked with the system. And now that they are applying, no one is bothering them.
Right.
Either they have to be a social activist, or they have to be a journalist, or they have to be, for example, maybe an artist. But why? They, with the whole family, like I can play tens and tens of messages that every day they are messaging me, and they think that I'm still in power and I have the authority to support them. So it is really like, it's a pity that they are not helped. And like them, there are many people who were at risk, but no one has contacted them. Why? Because they did not know, for example, websites, they did not know any, they did not have any links, they did not know international announcements, things like that.
And so let me, Hasina, let me ask you, you're here now, you're in Britain.
Yes.
And you speak excellent English, and you know about kind of bureaucracy and applications and stuff.
Yeah.
What is the quality of help that you think that they are getting now from the Foreign Office and the Home Office?
I have contacted with the Foreign Office as well, and they send me the forms. I have sent the forms back to my directors, so to find someone to help them out with them. But we have not yet heard, because what we heard was that they will consider the first batch, and for the second they will re-announce. So so far there has been no new updated news about that.
Jack Straw, we've had a lot in the Commons, and Hasina's just been giving us her first-hand account of this, but we had a lot of really detailed allegations in the Commons. this account from this 25-year-old official that has resonated with so many people about the Foreign Secretary being on holiday, the Permanent Secretary being on holiday, lots of officials working from home, and emails just not being answered. What is your view of this?
Well, my view is that it's unforgivable and was completely unnecessary. I understand the problems that face a foreign secretary and senior officials when you get an emergency, and by definition, the emergencies are things which can arise out of nowhere, or are one possibility of scenarios that could happen. But what you have to do when you're faced with an emergency is getting on top of it. I mean, the best example, it's not an exact parallel by any means, I can think of, which was Boxing Day 2004. We suddenly got news of the tsunami which was sweeping across Southeast Asia, and particularly in Thailand and Indonesia. Our initial response was much better than it had been at the time of the Bali bombing, for reasons that Tobias Ellwood raised. We greatly improved our response, but we also had to. We had an arrangement with the Metropolitan Police where we took over their huge response centre. We were still overwhelmed with calls, but what I did and what the senior officials had to do is come straight back to London and get on top of this, and then later on go out to Indonesia and to Thailand to look at what was going on. And it was by no means a perfect response, but it was a million times better than this, and it showed what could be done. I wouldn't criticize any of the officials below the very top, because my experience, and this was brought out yesterday by Peter Ricketts, Lord Ricketts, who was the Permanent Secretary just as I was leaving the Foreign Office, a very good senior official, was that the officials are absolutely up for handling emergencies. I mean, it's in a sense what they're trained for, but they need to be led, and they weren't led here, and it's an utter humiliation. I mean, what the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, thought he was doing on holiday for the whole period, I've no idea. Of course, you know, we all have families in politics, and I mean, I've often said I wouldn't want to marry a senior minister. Terrible. But however, there are upsides to having these positions. Huge privilege, huge responsibilities, and especially when there is a crisis, and you just need to get on top of it. And that was the failure here.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you for all the people who sent questions on this. Kushwa Babayeva, I didn't capture yours exactly, but about the charges, but I think we've covered the ground. I would just go on for a few minutes, if that's all right with you, just to take in a few more flanks of questions. Hasina, there's quite a few for you. One from Rebecca Parvin Graham saying, how do you feel the UK government can best support Afghan women and girls now? And should aid be distributed specifically to support women who are under threat? And others are asking, should aid to Afghanistan be made conditional on the treatment of women?
I think Britain has helped women as a part of gender equality and women empowerment, and they can also do much more. I very clearly indicated at the beginning for education, higher education, employment, support to widows, support to women-headed families. This is what they can do now. And coming to the evacuation process, definitely there is a group who are really at risk and they need support. I think it's never late to start up. They can still reconsider and rethink about how they can help those who are really at risk and about the aid. I think for conditionality, this is not the time. This is a critical crisis time in Afghanistan. Now, the support is required to all people. And then, definitely for the longer term, when we are defining the deal, on that time, definitely there should be a specific portion of conditionality for women. Because today, at this time, still it is the women who are hiddenly cooperating and coordinating with each other, not to go very much demoralized, but they are trying to mobilize and connect with each other. So there is always need for the conditional support and also specific allocation for women.
Okay, thank you. And one last question to Jack Straw. A lot of people saying, what have we learned from 20 years?
I think we've learned a lot. I mean, we learned it too late. I think there's some upside to our intervention. It had to take place because of 9/11. I've explained that. And I think Hasina and Tobias underlined the fact that there has been very substantial progress made in Afghanistan, which has changed the nature of Afghan society. And much of that is immutable. The Taliban can't do much about that. Some will try, but I don't think they will get very far. On the other hand, they are certainly trying to impose their view of Sharia law where they can, and that has a particular impact on women. I mean, there are plenty of other lessons to be learned. I've talked about the fact that we, frankly, got right round the axles over anti-narcotics, anti-terrorism strategy, and that was we needed greater clarity about that. There was always the issue, I mean, came up with Iraq as well, about whether the West should impose a Western model of democracy on societies which have had no particular tradition there, and where it may not even be a word in their language. And I think we may have pushed that too far. But critically, what was lacking with Afghanistan, particularly in later years, was an agreed strategy with allies, especially the United States, about where we were going. And all that happened, as we know, was that President Trump, adopting a completely unilateral policy, decided he'd had enough. And actually, Joe Biden then endorsed that policy without any of the kind of daily consultation that certainly we enjoyed with the Bush administration. And there are reasons for that. But one other lesson I would take away from this is that you have got to work really hard if you're Britain. And you did when we were in the EU, you have to do even more now to try and keep the US on side. And we won't always agree, but by God, we do need to get them to a position where they don't just take us for granted, as they frankly did over this withdrawal.
Thanks. And just one final question to Hasina. Someone has asked, but not given a name, what help can the Afghan diaspora, that's all the Afghans now outside Afghanistan, including in Britain, what help can they be to Afghanistan?
I think they are basically the voice of Afghans back there because they are directly or indirectly in contact. What help can they? They can bring attention of those priorities which the people really need at this time. I think this is the time that the diaspora, not only in Britain, but in the whole world, they leave their usual agendas, but they should come to a crisis agenda. And they can be really a power of support to those people who are really stuck and who need our help. So they have a big influence, they have a big voice, because it's the diaspora who are connected in with the British. And then they can be a hook in a pass-through for the messaging up at the policy level.
Okay, well, thank you for that very much. We're going to have to draw it to a close then. I think there are terrific questions, the ones I've asked, and many others coming in, and including going right back to the roots of the war, which I think we don't have time for today, but questions noted. Thanks very much. My particular thanks to Hasina, Safi, and Jack Straw, and in his absence to Tobias Ellwood. It is an exceptionally busy day in the Commons, and we're very glad to have had him. Thank you very much indeed for watching, and as I said, it will be on our website very soon.